Hi friends, this is your pal Scott Garibay, and today we are going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons and their incredible collaboration with Lego. It's really, I've really been thinking a lot about Dungeons and Dragons, and I think what's interesting, and especially about its competitors, right? Recently there has been three specific games that have really surged forward and really tried to knock the king off the hill, right? To become the number one tabletop role playing game. The three different companies came out of the OGL, um, and the OGL crisis, which was in January of 2023, and just got really upset and were like, hey, we and actually the D&D community got upset about Hasbro's desire to change the OGL. And it was a big deal, right? And there were three major companies that came out with three major games that, in my humble opinion, were specifically targeted at being the number one tabletop role-playing game in the world. So I'm very, very interested in Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm interested in its competitors, right? So what's interesting is nobody ever even comes close, right? Like Professor Dungeon Master recently did a fantastic metric, and he explained at Gen Con, there were 1,300 tables that you could go play Dungeons and Dragons at. The number two was Pathfinder at 500. Not even half. Not even half, right? The same number. The number 20 on that list I didn't even have 25 tables, right? So Dungeons and Dragons crushes its competition. It's so far ahead of its competition. And I think the reason why is, at this point, every single competitor in the world to Dungeons and Dragons is like, we're going to make a better tabletop role-playing game than Dungeons and Dragons, and then we will beat Dungeons and Dragons. And I think what you have to understand is that's not how anyone is ever going to beat Dungeons and Dragons. I think there are multiple games that have been made that are better tabletop role-playing games than Dungeons and Dragons. But the reason they lose to Dungeons and Dragons is Dungeons and Dragons has absolutely burst out of the container of tabletop role-playing game, and it is really a cultural phenomenon. It is a cultural phenomenon. And really not even an American cultural phenomenon. It is a global cultural phenomenon. It is phenomenally successful, right? It's in a lot of really strange directions. Okay, you guys have been very patient. Let me get to the Lego part. So the reason we're talking about today is I recently saw a 3-year-old statistics. Okay, now this statistic's 3 years old. I'm betting that the numbers are even higher now. But even if they're off, I doubt they're off by more than 25% max, lower. And I'm actually wouldn't be surprised if these are significantly higher. These numbers are dramatically higher today. So Lego has 24,000 employees. 24,000 people are employed by Legos, right? That's absolutely astonishing. And by the way, if I haven't already said this, in April of 2024, Dungeons and Dragons became canon to Lego. Lego became canon to Dungeons and Dragons, with the Dungeons and Dragons Lego Dragon's Tail Red with the Lego Dungeons and Dragons Red Dragon's Tail set. It was a $360 set. It had I believe 6 minifigs in it. It had a castle in it. It had a dragon in it. And get this, it had, this is not a joke, it literally had a rules book for it was a rules book at the size you would find in a starter set. It wasn't a full 256 pages, but it was an entire rule set just to play Dungeons and Dragons with Lego. It was an incredible moment. Okay, and at this point, permanently, Dungeons and Dragons is linked to Lego, and Lego are linked to Dungeons and Dragons. And this is a big deal, because I actually, and so I get pretty into almost anything that is attached to Dungeons and Dragons. The only thing that I seem to have immunity from is video games. I actually have zero interest in any video game that is made, even if it's 100% Dungeons & Dragons. I'm just not that big of a video game fan. And but any other product, I'm pretty interested in it, right? And I own quite a bit of it. And I definitely went really in on Lego and Dungeons & Dragons because I think this is I think it's a huge reason that you cannot beat Dungeons & Dragons by making a better tabletop role-playing game. And what's interesting is I think at this point, I really think, especially since we saw 3 companies try to take Dungeons & Dragons down recently, it's impossible to take Dungeons & Dragons down if you are trying to make a better product than them. Because you're showing up to a fight to defeat your enemy, but your enemy's in a different arena, right? Like Dungeons & Dragons is no longer functioning as a tabletop role-playing game. It is really functioning as a cultural phenomenon. And so this is one of the reasons why it's near impossible to get anybody to play any other tabletop role-playing game. And why? And it's not just me saying this. You will find 1,000 people on YouTube saying you have to drag people to any other TTRPG other than D&D. And if you even get them to play, they're often unhappy, right? Like and like you'll like Sly Flourish, I think Bob World Builder. Quite a few people have been like, "Hey, let me help you with this problem because it's so strong of a problem." And I think the reason it's a problem is you're saying, "Hey, do you want to play this game?" And anybody who invites them to Dungeons & Dragons, they're like, "Hey, do you want to be part of a phenomenon?" Right? Like, do you want to be part of a community? Do you want to be part of a cultural history, a cultural future, a cultural present? Do you want to be part of one of the greatest intellectual property crossovers that has ever happened, right? Whereas if you invite somebody to play DCC, you're like, hey, do you want to go through this dungeon, right? But if you invite them to Dungeons & Dragons, they're saying, hey, do you want to be more excited this Thanksgiving, this Christmas, this New Year's? When you watch Stranger Things, do you want to understand that show in a new way, right? And no other tabletop role-playing game in the world can do this. And one of the reasons why Dungeons & Dragons sits at this, as a passerine, right, a perching bird on this branch is Lego, right? It's these type of massive, huge crossovers that make it unbeatable. It is, and I really think no one has a chance of beating Dungeons & Dragons until they realize you cannot stop at making a good game. You have to make a cultural phenomenon, right? And Dungeons & Dragons has gone so far down this road, right? So Lego has 24,000 employees, and its revenue 3 years ago was $42 billion. $42 billion, right? And what's really amazing is DCC and OSE and Traveler and 100 other games are trying to compete with Dungeons & Dragons. And they're like, oh, we're going to work hard and we're going to get this out to the tabletop role-playing game community. And, Dungeons & Dragons is like, when you walk into, I was about to say Toys R Us, that's not true. When you walk into Boscov's, when you walk into Target, when you walk into Walmart, when you walk into Barnes & Noble, there is a chance you will leave having a desire to find out more about Dungeons & Dragons, right? Because you bought a Lego set. You built the Lego set and you fell in love with it. And then you're like, oh, you know what? I would like to build more Lego sets. Let me go to Lego. And Lego's like, hey, you want a $360 set that's all about Dungeons & Dragons as a Lego set? Wait, there's a bunch of my favorite intellectual properties that don't have a Lego set. Why does Dungeons & Dragons have a Lego set? Because it's a cultural phenomenon. Because it's literally done business with the U.S. government. I mean, it's astonishing. It is absolutely astonishing. Lego, 3 years ago, had 24,000 employees and made $42 billion. Billion with a B, right? And every single Lego set that is ever sold now and in the future, and even ones that were printed in the past that are being resold, not by Lego, but by resellers, is just a gigantic advertisement for Dungeons & Dragons. And it's these types of crossovers. And what's even more important is like, I think that the Lego Dungeons and Dragons, deal got done because Lego was like, yeah, of course, because Dungeons and Dragons was like, of course, the U.S. president will allow you to make Dungeons and Dragons stamps. Yeah, you could put our image on what essentially is U.S. currency. Like, it's astounding. Like, and there's no way to beat Dungeons and Dragons until companies start to realize you can't stop at making a great game. You have to make a cultural phenomenon. Every single word you just heard in this video is my humble opinion. Nothing more, nothing less. The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion. When you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider like, subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.